The screaming child's body burst through the smoke and flames like a burning angel, as retired Sergeant Nicholas Barrow launched himself from the exploding van, his own clothes igniting as he crashed onto the asphalt with 4-year-old Tommy Hernandez, clutched against his scarred chest. 30 seconds earlier, Nicholas had been sitting on his usual bench outside Murphy's gas station on the outskirts of Tallahassee, watching the evening shadows stretch across the cracked parking lot like fingers, reaching for darkness. His face and hands bore the twisted geography of third-degree burns, keloid scars that mapped a catastrophe from 18 months ago, when his world had ended in flames and screaming metal. The burns weren't the worst part. The worst part was, coming here every evening, forcing himself to breathe the petroleum-soaked air that sent his nervous system into revolt, that triggered flashbacks so vivid he could taste the smoke and hear Detective Maria Santos screaming his name as she burned, alive in their patrol car. But tonight was different. Tonight, a soccer mom named Jennifer Hernandez had pulled her aging Ford Transit van into the station, smoke pouring from under the hood while her son slept in the back seat. She stood in the fluorescent wash of the overhead lights, cell phone, pressed to her ear as she frantically explained to AAA that she was stranded with a child in a vehicle that was definitely not supposed to be making those sounds. Nicholas watched from his bench 40 feet away, his PTSD-trained eyes automatically cataloging details that civilian panic overlooked. The way the smoke had changed color from white to gray, suggesting electrical fire rather than simple overheating. The dark stain spreading beneath the engine compartment, which could be coolant but looked suspiciously like gasoline. The faint crackling sound that meant wiring insulation was burning away, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophic failure. He'd seen this exact scenario during his 15 years as a Florida Highway Patrol officer, usually in the aftermath, when the fire department was already hosing down twisted metal and collecting whatever remained of the passengers. The chemistry was simple and brutal. Overheated electrical system plus fuel leak plus oxygen equals explosion and death, with a timeline measured in seconds rather than minutes. "Ma'am," Nicholas called out, rising from his bench on unsteady legs. His voice carried the raspy damage of smoke inhalation that had never fully healed. "You need to get away from that vehicle." Jennifer looked up from her phone call, taking in his appearance with the quick assessment that most people made when encountering his scars. The burns covered the left side of his face from temple to jaw, pulling his skin into a permanent expression of melted anguish. His hands were worse, twisted claws that had once been capable of delicate police work but now struggled to hold a coffee cup steady. "I'm sorry," she said, the phone still pressed to her ear. "The van," Nicholas said, walking toward her with the careful gait of someone whose body had been rebuilt with metal pins and surgical mesh. "There's fuel leaking and the electrical system is compromised. You need to get your son out of there and move away from the vehicle." Jennifer glanced back at the van, where 4-year-old Tommy remained asleep in his car seat, exhausted from a day at Disney World that was supposed to end with them safely home in Jacksonville. She was a single mother, working 2 jobs to afford this vacation, and the van represented her only means of transportation and financial stability. The idea that it might explode seemed like something from a movie rather than real life. "The tow guy said it's probably just the radiator," she said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. Nicholas was close enough now to smell the gasoline, and the familiar scent hit his nervous system like a physical blow. Suddenly he was back in the patrol car with Maria, responding to a domestic violence call that had turned into an ambush. The smell of fuel mixing with smoke as the vehicle burned around them. Maria's hand in his as she begged him to get out, to save himself, to leave her behind because her legs were pinned and the fire was spreading. He'd tried. God knew he'd tried. But the doors were jammed and the windows wouldn't break, and Maria had used her last breath to scream at him to run, to live, to not let her death be meaningless by dying alongside her. "Sir?" Jennifer's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Are you okay?" Nicholas blinked, forcing himself back to the present moment. The smell of gasoline was stronger now, and he could see flames beginning to lick at the underside of the van's engine compartment. Maybe 30 seconds before the fuel tank ignited, maybe less. "Get your son," he said with quiet urgency. "Right now." But Jennifer was already turning back to the van, her maternal instincts finally overriding her disbelief as she saw the orange glow beginning to spread beneath the vehicle. She yanked open the sliding door and began fumbling with Tommy's car seat straps, her hands shaking as the complex buckle system that was designed to protect children in crashes became a deadly obstacle in an emergency. "I can't get it," she gasped, panic making her clumsy. The buckle stuck. Nicholas could see flames spreading along the fuel line now, creating a countdown timer that would end in white-hot death for everyone within 30 feet of the explosion. The smart thing would be to grab Jennifer and run, to save the person who could be saved and accept the loss of the child who was trapped. That's what his training taught him. That's what any rational person would do. But rational people didn't sit on benches outside gas stations every night, forcing themselves to breathe the smell of their nightmares. Rational people moved on from trauma instead of building shrines to their failures. "Move," Nicholas said, pushing Jennifer aside and diving into the van's interior. The car seat harness was indeed jammed, the plastic buckle warped by heat from the engine fire that was spreading faster than he'd anticipated. Nicholas pulled out his pocket knife, the same Benchmade blade he'd carried as a patrol officer, and began sawing through the nylon straps with hands that remembered their training, despite the scar tissue that limited their dexterity. Tommy stirred as the straps came free, opening sleepy eyes to see a stranger's burned face leaning over him. Any other child might have screamed, but Tommy simply reached up with the trusting innocence of someone too young to understand that monsters were real. "Hey there, buddy," Nicholas whispered, lifting the boy from his seat just as the first explosion rocked the van. The blast came from the engine compartment, turning the hood into twisted metal shrapnel and sending a fireball rolling across the roof of the vehicle. Nicholas felt the heat wash over him like a physical force, bringing back every sensation from the night Maria died. The sound of metal tearing, the smell of burning fuel, the terrible brightness of fire consuming everything it touched. But this time was different. This time he had someone to save. Nicholas threw himself out of the van's side door just as the fuel tank ignited, the main explosion lifting the vehicle off its wheels and turning night into day with a pillar of flame that could be seen for miles. He hit the asphalt hard. Tommy clutched against his chest, his own clothes smoldering from the heat. Jennifer was screaming. His name, Tommy's name, prayers to a God who might or might not be listening. Other people had appeared, drawn by the explosion, cell phones already recording what would become viral video of a burned man saving a child from a fireball. Nicholas lay on the ground, staring up at the Florida sky through the smoke and flames, listening to Tommy cry and knowing that this time, finally, after 18 months of failure and guilt and sleepless nights, he had been fast enough. The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by fire trucks and police cars and news vans that materialized like vultures drawn to spectacle. Nicholas allowed himself to be loaded onto a stretcher, his hands burned again but not seriously, while Tommy was checked for smoke inhalation and released to his sobbing mother. "Sir," one of the paramedics said as they wheeled him toward the ambulance, "can you tell me your name?" "Nicholas Barrow," he replied, watching the van burn with the detached fascination of someone who had seen too much fire in his lifetime. "Retired Florida Highway Patrol." The paramedic made notes on his clipboard, but Nicholas could see recognition in the man's eyes. Everyone in emergency services knew the story of Sergeant Barrow and Detective Santos, the two cops who'd walked into a domestic violence call that turned into an execution and came out with one of them dead and the other wishing he had died instead. At the hospital, Nicholas endured the familiar ritual of burn treatment, cleaning, debridement, bandaging, while Jennifer Hernandez sat in the waiting room giving interviews to local news stations about the scarred stranger who had saved her son's life. The story would make national news within hours. Hero cop saves child from burning van, with feel-good segments about overcoming trauma and second chances. None of the reporters would mention that Nicholas came to the gas station every night, specifically hoping for this opportunity. None of them would understand that this wasn't spontaneous heroism, but the culmination of 18 months of careful preparation for a chance at redemption. "How do you feel?" asked Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician who was treating his burns. She'd read his file, understood the psychological dimension of his injuries as well as the physical ones. Different, Nicholas said honestly. Like I might be able to sleep tonight. The burns on your hands aren't serious, Dr. Chen said, applying antibiotic ointment with gentle efficiency. Second degree, but they'll heal. You were lucky. Lucky. Nicholas almost smiled at the word. For 18 months he'd felt like the unluckiest man alive. The survivor who should have died. The partner who failed to save his friend. The hero who had arrived too late when it mattered most. But tonight, luck had finally shifted in his favor. Tonight he had been exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there, with exactly the skills required to save a life instead of watching it burn away. Mr. Barrow, Dr. Chen said as she finished bandaging his hands. The psychiatrist on call would like to speak with you about what happened tonight and about other things. Nicholas understood what she meant. The hospital staff had read his file, knew about the PTSD diagnosis and the survivor's guilt that had driven him to the edge of suicide multiple times since Maria's death. They were concerned that tonight's heroics might be followed by another crash when the adrenaline wore off and the reality of his unchanged life reasserted itself. I'm fine, he said, though he knew the words carried little weight coming from someone whose idea of therapy was nightly visits to gas stations. You saved a child's life tonight, Dr. Chen said, studying his scarred face with professional curiosity. That's not something fine people do by accident. She was right, though not in the way she imagined. Nicholas had indeed saved Tommy Hernandez, by design rather than chance, but the design had been 18 months in the making and built on foundations of guilt that no civilian could understand. Every night for the past year and a half, Nicholas had positioned himself at Murphy's gas station during the evening hours when mechanical failures were most likely to coincide with heavy traffic. He'd studied the patterns of emergency vehicle response, memorized the locations of fire extinguishers and emergency shutoffs, and trained his damaged body to ignore the psychological triggers that gasoline smells produced. It wasn't heroism, it was penance. A systematic attempt to recreate the circumstances of Maria's death with a different outcome, to prove to himself that his failure to save his partner had been due to circumstances rather than cowardice. Tonight had been the culmination of that preparation. When Jennifer Hernandez's van began showing signs of imminent explosion, Nicholas had been ready with knowledge gained from 18 months of studying automotive fires and the split-second timing required to extract passengers from burning vehicles. But as he lay in the hospital bed listening to news reports describing him as a hero who had overcome trauma to save a child's life, Nicholas realized that the preparation itself had become a form of healing. The nightly exposure to gasoline fumes had gradually reduced his PTSD symptoms. The physical training required to overcome his burn injuries had restored strength and flexibility he'd thought lost forever. Most importantly, the single-minded focus on being ready to save someone had given him a purpose beyond survivor's guilt and self-recrimination. Jennifer Hernandez appeared in his doorway as Dr. Chen finished the paperwork, Tommy asleep in her arms and her face bright with the kind of gratitude that couldn't be expressed in words. I don't know how to thank you, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. If you hadn't been there, I was there, Nicholas said simply. That's what matters. Why? She asked. I mean, you could have been hurt, you could have died. Why risk your life for strangers? Nicholas considered the question, thinking about Maria Santos and the promise he'd made to her memory during 18 months of self-imposed torture. The promise to never again let someone die because he wasn't brave enough or fast enough or prepared enough to act when action was required. Because somebody should, he said finally. Because if good people don't take risks for strangers, then the only people taking risks are the ones who want to hurt people. Jennifer nodded as if this made perfect sense, though Nicholas suspected she would spend years trying to understand the psychology of a man who had deliberately traumatized himself in order to be ready to help others. As she left with Tommy, Nicholas closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had felt peace instead of constant guilt. It had been the morning before Maria died, when they'd been driving to work and arguing about whether the Miami Heat had any chance against the Lakers in the playoffs. Such a small thing. two cops arguing about basketball. But it represented a time when the future had seemed manageable and death had been something that happened to other people in other places. Tonight, for the first time in 18 months, Nicholas could imagine feeling that way again. Not immediately, not without more work and probably professional help, but eventually. The certainty that he could act when action was required had broken the cycle of self-doubt that had kept him trapped in endless replay loops of Maria's final moments. Dr. Chen returned with discharge papers and a business card for a trauma counselor who specialized in first responder PTSD. "She's expecting your call," the doctor said. "And Mr. Barrow, what you did tonight? That took real courage." Nicholas accepted the card and the compliment with equal skepticism. Courage implied choice, and he wasn't sure he'd had any choice in tonight's events. When he saw Tommy trapped in that van, every other consideration had simply disappeared. He'd moved toward the danger because moving away from it would have meant living with another death on his conscience, and that was literally unthinkable. But maybe that was what courage actually looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something more important than fear. Outside the hospital, dawn was breaking over Tallahassee, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Nicholas of flames, but no longer triggered the panic response that had controlled his life for so long. The smell of gasoline still lingered in his clothes, but for the first time in 18 months, it smelled like possibility rather than failure. He walked slowly toward the bus stop, his hands stiff with fresh bandages, but his mind clearer than it had been since the night Maria died. Tonight, he would not go to Murphy's gas station. Tonight, he would call the trauma counselor, whose business card was folded in his pocket. Tonight, he would begin the work of learning how to live with saving someone instead of losing them. The news vans had already left the hospital parking lot, their crews rushing to edit footage of the burned hero who had saved a child from an exploding van. By evening, the story would be trending on social media as an example of courage triumphing over trauma, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded action. None of the coverage would mention that Nicholas Barrow had spent 18 months deliberately exposing himself to his greatest fear in preparation for exactly this kind of emergency. None of the reporters would understand that his heroism had been as calculated as a military operation, planned and rehearsed and executed with the precision of someone who had turned redemption into a science. But as Nicholas waited for the bus, that would take him home to the first peaceful sleep he'd had in 18 months, he realized that the public narrative didn't matter. What mattered was that Tommy Hernandez was alive, that Jennifer Hernandez had her son back, and that somewhere in the universe, Maria Santos could rest knowing that her partner had finally learned how to be fast enough when it counted. The bus arrived, and Nicholas climbed aboard with the careful movements of someone whose body bore the permanent marks of heroism and failure in equal measure. As the vehicle pulled away from the hospital, he caught his reflection in the window. Scarred face, bandaged hands, but eyes that no longer carried the haunted look of someone who had failed to save the people he'd sworn to protect. For the first time in 18 months, Sergeant Nicholas Barrow looked like a man who might have a future worth living. What Nicholas would never know, what Jennifer Hernandez would never suspect, and what would remain buried in classified federal investigation files, was that Tommy's car seat had been deliberately sabotaged earlier that evening by domestic terrorists targeting single mothers as part of a broader campaign to destabilize American society through random violence against vulnerable populations. The van's mechanical failure had been caused by an improvised incendiary device planted while Jennifer was inside the Disney World gift shop, timed to detonate during the drive home when the vehicle would be isolated on dark highways. Nicholas's intervention had not only saved Tommy's life, but prevented what was intended to be the first in a series of attacks designed to terrorize American families and erode public confidence in basic safety. The real hero of the evening was an FBI surveillance team that had been tracking the terrorist cell for 6 months and had identified Jennifer as a potential target based on social media posts about her Disney vacation. Federal agents had been positioned at Murphy's gas station specifically to intervene if the attack proceeded as planned, but Nicholas's unexpected presence and actions had eliminated the need for official intervention while preserving the ongoing investigation into the terrorist network.